So I want to welcome everybody. I know we've got most of our folks online with us, so thanks for joining us. And I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and move on and go through the agenda.
Great. And so the main items today, we want to just mention the public workshop that happened on November 2nd. And just share with you briefly just a bullet pointed list of what was covered. So that was last week. And then big item Aaron has put together a matrix of the three allocation systems currently being implemented in the GSAs and the Kaweah Subbasin. And we want to go through that in detail, maybe even painful detail, just to talk about where the allocation system interacts with the water marketing strategy. So it'll be important to understand those allocation systems and where they're similar, which is in the great majority of items, but then a few areas where they're different.
I did not get your application, and I realized on number 1, and I need to do that. So Jeremy, maybe you can help me get his application out to everybody immediately after this meeting here. So we'll have to skip over number 1.
Okay, great. All right. So this is actually, in the parking lot looking at these, I reversed the order. So I wanted to talk about the workshop quickly before we recap the earlier October meeting. And so we met. It was a hybrid event, and we had about half a dozen people in the room and a similar number online, would you say?
Yeah, about that. It was like
so about a dozen people attended. The topics of discussion were first, we recapped the previous public workshop, which had happened a year earlier, for the benefit of anyone attending on the 19th who hadn't attended the previous public workshop. The major thing covered in the previous public workshop was the review of existing water markets and strategies. And then what we really spent some time going over during that public workshop were the guiding principles that this committee adopted. And so we talked about the process. We showed them the Jamboard exercise and the spreadsheet where all of the comments were cataloged and categorized, and then walked through in detail the specific each of the guiding principles, and gave the public the opportunity to comment on and ask questions. And then we went through the basic outline of version 1.0 of the water market. So all of those things that this committee had decided on as of October 19th. And so it was just a high level overview of what decisions have been made and what the next steps are, where we're headed. So there were some, some good questions. So at the end of this, obviously as we continue to make progress on defining what this version 1.0 market looks like, there's a list of outstanding questions that that this committee has generated. And so there were some where the same questions were asked, and even some new interesting questions that I'll pose to this committee later today. In terms of next steps, there is a set of office hours tomorrow. That's 4:30 to 6.
Yeah, that's the 26th.
Thank you. So that's the wrong date there. That's easy to fix. Thank you. And so tomorrow, 4:30 to 6. Pardon me. And that we have already shared the Zoom link. That will be virtual only, but that's an opportunity for any members of the committee. If you want to stop in, you're welcome, but it's mostly for folks in the public who either couldn't attend on October 19th or who weren't comfortable making public comments or asking questions publicly in that forum. So they can just drop in during that hour and a half. This will be our second set of office hours, and they can share their comments and questions. So any questions or thoughts? Anything else you'd like to know about the public workshop if you weren't able to attend? What's nice is there was very thoughtful discussion and questions. No controversy of any kind, no hint of controversy, which is great. All right, so previous market recap. So just to remind you what we did just 2 weeks ago or so, 3 weeks ago, I guess, when we were here, the rescheduled September meeting in early October, we did a walkthrough of the water accounting dashboard. So just to refresh your memory, you see a snapshot here. It is the vision of this process that this will be the basis for people learning the status of their own water use, either what they have available to sell, or it will also help them identify a need to purchase additional allocation. You can see here, as we discussed previously, the water accounting dashboard will provide an individual water user with a separate account summary by GSA. So if a landowner has APNs in the Mid-Kaweah, it'll show the total allocation, the water supply for that property, as well as their usage to date. And then it will show that separately for, in this case, the Greater Kaweah. So whichever GSAs that landowner happens to have APNs in. And there will be some updates to this. There will be some updates to this platform required in order to support trading. One is we'll need location information. So we'll need to know which analysis zone each APN is located in. We'll actually need to create a new field here in this water account summary table that says water available for trade. Again, someone can trade up to 10 inches of water per acre, conditional on not exceeding their total water supply. And so we'll need a system of reporting that directly to market participants. And then importantly, we'll need the ability to update a particular field that's already in the water accounting dashboard called groundwater credits. Groundwater credits can be generated a number of ways. For example, if someone doesn't use allocation in a given year and it carries over, it generates a groundwater credit that can be used in the future. And so a transfer of pumping in the market, a very simple way to account for that would be to generate, to subtract from someone's, record a transfer as a water use on the part of the seller, and to record it as a groundwater credit generated on the part of the buyer. But we'll need the ability to update that groundwater credits field net of any transfers, right? So that'll be a straightforward way to record transfers so that an individual's water supply and water use update automatically. The nice thing is that the water accounting dashboard already presents this information in a clear, straightforward way. And so it seems like that would just be a very minor adjustment needed to facilitate the accounting of transfers between water users.
I would think there would be a subcategory though within that, just so you can see what's coming and going.
Yeah. What was the source of the groundwater credit, right? Was it carryover? Was it a transfer? Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. So any thoughts or comments or questions about the accounting dashboard? If in particular, if there's someone who wasn't at the last committee meeting, are there any questions that you have?
Feel free to unmute your phone and or raise your hand.
All right. If you think of something, don't hesitate to jump in and stop me at any point. So then the other thing we did last meeting is we reviewed the decisions that had already been made about the structure and rules for this version 1.0 market. And then we actually, and so here those are. So these were already decided previously, but the goal here is to design a version 1.0 market that can be implemented in the current water year, where the unit traded will just be 1 acre foot of allocation measured as evapotranspiration. These would be one-time transfers up to 10 inches per acre from an individual's water supply. That 10 inches per acre is the native yield that an individual receives. So it's equivalent to the native yield that an individual receives. And then eligible participants would be any landowner. These are agricultural landowners who hold allocation and are current with all fees, ordinances, rules, and regulations. We reviewed that in a previous meeting. We had talked about the type of the exchange, the availability of price information, mitigation of adverse impacts. I won't belabor these because these were things we discussed in detail over each of the last two meetings. But this is a monthly auction conducted in at least in the first 3 months and last 3 months of the water period. We want maximum price information, although anonymized, quantity for each transfer. And then we talked about these triggers, which would result in restrictions, distance over which pumping can happen, or transfers of pumping can happen, and may even result in the suspension of trading. And those are an MT trigger, a minimum threshold trigger, and a disadvantaged community trigger. Then last time we sort of started to get into the details of how this market will function and what the implications of various rules are. So these are decisions that were now made in the last committee. We asked the question, how do we handle this 45-day lag? It may actually only be 30 days as the updates are coming more rapidly now. So how do we handle this 30 to 45-day lag in water use data? The fact that when someone sees their most recent water usage, they're really seeing the state of their water usage a month earlier. And the committee decided that the existing fees and penalties actually provide really powerful incentives for water users to be forward-looking and to anticipate that their water use may already be greater than what's recorded in the dashboard, and to plan accordingly. And that in particular, the committee noted that the penalty tier, which requires an individual to forego that amount of allocation in the next year, was a very, very powerful incentive. You don't just pay a penalty, you lose that same amount of water in the next year. We actually talked about how these transfers would be approved. So a transfer that's matched through whatever trading platform is implemented, how do those transfers actually get approved by the GSA? And the committee just chose to use a transfer form that's submitted to GSA staff for approval. So those transfers will be individually submitted for approval, with the understanding that however long administratively it takes for those transfers to be approved, for those forms to be processed and the transfers to be approved, that we can't implement the next auction until the previous auction's transfers have been approved. So there'll be some learning in terms of how long it takes to get those transfers approved. Maybe it will be very quickly, maybe it won't. Financial transactions will be executed by the exchange administrator in the interest of preserving anonymity, so that the participants in the water market don't learn the identities of the counterparty on the other side of a trade, or counterparties. And so in terms of anonymity, we talked about, do you want to know the identity of the counterparty? There was a resounding no. And do you want partial matches, right? Do you need, if someone wants to sell 100 acre feet, do they need to find someone who will buy all 100 acre feet, or can you sell 50 feet to one person, 50 acre feet to another? And so all that's possible while maintaining anonymity through the facilitation of an exchange administrator. And so those are the things that we talked about last committee meeting in early October. So any questions or comments before we dive into the content for this week's meeting? Excellent. All right. Okay, so I want to walk through this GSA allocation matrix carefully and encourage you to jump in and make comments and ask questions, especially where you may have insight into a particular GSA's system and how this will play out. I appreciate that insight. And so just go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand if you have a comment. Right now, you're seeing a little snapshot of what Aaron put together. And now I'm going to go to the actual spreadsheet, and we will start to walk through this. So what you see here is under the appropriate header is the allocation system, the details of the allocation system implemented by each of the GSAs. Greater in the leftmost column, Mid-Kaweah in the middle, and East on the right-hand side. And then what Aaron has done is he's organized this nicely by a particular characteristic or feature so that we can compare them side by side. So just as an example, to start simply, what you see here in the very first row is it indicates how each of these allocation systems were adopted. And so in the greater and the East, these are actually part of formal rules and regulations adopted by the GSA, whereas in Mid-Kaweah, the allocation system that you're going to see was passed as an emergency ordinance. And Aaron, I'm curious, do you have any comments you want to make about the relevance of whether it's rules and regulations or emergency ordinance?
You know, the Mid-Kaweah's approach to the emergency ordinance was to have flexibility in that it's not a permanent set of rules and regulations. And the emergency ordinance corresponded to implementation in the middle of a year to respond to a drought condition. And I would say that, you know, our goal is next year we would be at rules and regulations. And if you open East Kaweah or greater, you open ours, there's very little, you know, structural difference. We start out almost identical.
Yeah, I think it's also important to realize that the vision of Sigma is that nothing is permanent, right? That there's a process of a periodic evaluation and adjustment. So, anyway, so I don't know that that's super relevant. So I guess we'll learn. In terms of eligible land, this is just a minor detail.
It's a minor detail, but it has other implications, right? So,
okay.
Yeah, right. Because if you're 2 acres or less, theoretically, you couldn't trade. Now, you wouldn't be.
But you also don't have an allocation, right? So you don't have.
You're not regulated. You don't have a cap, so there's no need to trade. Yep.
Yeah. So notice that in East Kaweah, any parcel greater 2 acres or larger gets an allocation, which means really in this case gets a cap, and then that is 4 acres in the Mid-Kaweah.
And then I realized I think I got that wrong in the greater Kaweah. And I don't know if Eric's online, but I think it's irrigated agriculture as of 2020.
That's what it says down here for allocation.
Oh, okay. So that's probably what it was. It was the allocation only counts.
Yep.
So, okay.
Yep.
And
Right, so
on the East
please.
Kaweah, the native goes to everybody 2 acres and above, which you have, and then the tier 1 only goes to irrigated acreage, and I think it's the same thing. It's as of 2020, unless you prove that you're irrigating now to get the tier 1 bucket as well.
Hey, will you repeat that? So is it tier 1 and 2?
So at the East Kaweah, you've got the native goes to 2 acres and above. That's correct. The tier 1 and the tier 1 and tier 2 last year goes to only irrigated acreage. And you can leave that note in there fine, because there is no tier 2 this year, but there was last year. So that's where it's going to. And it doesn't matter if you've got 5 acres out of a 10-acre block to irrigated, you get the tier 1 or tier 2 on the entire assessor parcel size.
Great. Okay,
So
so
although there's
native-
only like 85,000 irrigated acres in East Kaweah, there's about 92 to 95,000 that's actually getting all the tiered water.
Okay, so did I characterize that right? Native goes to all APNs larger than 2 acres, but tier 1 only to irrigated parcels as of January 31st, 2020.
Yeah.
Great.
Is the presumption those are de minimis users then?
Yeah,
the
so
2 acres
yeah, I mean,
established?
we assess everybody 2 acres and above, and that's kind of why that's not the reason why the native only goes to them. It's the fact that we assume, or for the most part, anyone smaller than 2 acres is probably considered a de minimis user. And that bucket of water is already kind of stripped out of the native before we allocate the native.
And our goal on the 4 acres was to really account for those small farmers. The disadvantaged farmers are usually like 4 to 5 acres or less. So we're just kind of saying, you know, is their pumping going to change the landscape? Probably not. So we're not going to burden them with a cap. Then again, they're not going to be incentivized with trading.
And why would they? Because it says can petition parcels less than 4 acres.
For some odd reason, if we left it open, if they had an
They
adamant,
want
they wanted a cap, and they,
Okay.
we just don't want to.
Yep.
Anybody that want to self-impose a cap, we're all for it, but didn't. We went around and counted the number of those parcels, and it was
Great. I just wanted to question how many.
very little in our area.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So
We have quite
Any-
a few in East Kaweah that are of that category.
hey, so Craig, I really appreciate those those corrections and additions. So anyone on the call, if where you have knowledge, we understand that this was a first pass. We may have some details wrong, and we really do want to create sort of the authoritative comparison here. So thank you for that.
And I'll just go down to the next wall
Please.
while I'm on East Kaweah. So the 2.5 is the hard cap with transfers, but if someone wanted to, they could just pay the $500 and lose next year's allocation if they want to go up to the 2.5 without finding transfers. The
Yep.
idea is they're gonna have transferred water to get to that cap, but the reality is they could just pump and then know they're losing
that's-
next year's allocation, so.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what's called the penalty tier, 500 per acre feet, and 1-to-1 loss in the following year. Great. All right. Sorry, Sophie, you had a question, please?
You skipped down, and so I lost where we were, but you have gone back up to allocation coverage, right? Thank you.
Great. So now I want to talk about the cap and then the individual tiers. So I'm going to scroll down now. So feel free to request I scroll back up at any time. And so interestingly, the cap, the individual water users cap is 2.7 acre feet per acre in the greater and 2.5 acre feet per acre in the mid. And I'm going to distinguish that it works a little bit different than in east. Now, if you notice, if you look at the greater Kaweah column, that 2.7 is the sum of the native yield, which is 0.83, tier 1, which is 0.83 acre feet, and tier 2, which is 1.04. So you add those 3 numbers up, you get a cap of 2.7 acre feet. And then as you look down, you actually see what the cost is. Native arrives at a cost of $0. Tier 1 at a cost of $125 per acre foot. And tier 2, that extra 1 acre foot per acre, $250 an acre foot. And so this is what someone can pump free of any penalty simply by paying the fee associated with each of those types of water. And it works similarly, except the numbers are different in Mid-Kaweah. So 2.5 acre feet is the sum of native yield of 0.83, tier 1 of 0.83, and tier 2 of 0.83. And the numbers are a little different, but it's very similar. Native is $0 per acre foot.
Where are
Whereas
those numbers?
tier 1, down the bottom here, tier 1 is $160 per acre foot. And tier 2 is $210 an acre foot. So absent, without any transfers, someone in the Mid-Kaweah can pump up to 2.5 acre feet per acre by paying the fees associated with those 3 buckets. Now it's a little bit different in the East Kaweah because if you add up an individual's native yields or their tier 1, that's 1.1 acre feet per acre, right? So that's the amount they can pump just by paying the tier 1 fee. They can, as Craig mentioned, they can continue pumping up to 2.5 acre feet per acre, either by securing transfers from another individual or by simply paying the penalty tier, which is $500 an acre foot plus a 1-to-1 loss. And so now I'm going to direct you down here to the bottom. Notice that in all three basins, we're exceeding the cap. So if we're exceeding 2.7 acre feet in greater, 2.5 acre feet in Mid-Kaweah, or 1.15 in East, there is the same penalty tier, which is $500 an acre feet plus 1-to-1 loss of that amount in future years. So in a minute, we should talk about accounting rules. And in fact, for the benefit of making this easier to see, so kind of roll up a little nicer. So are there any questions about the cap, the native tier 1 and tier 2, and the penalty tier before we talk about accounting rules?
Yeah, can you go through the reduction in tier water? It's a little unclear the way it looks like that's an allocation of the 100%. So the reduction for 23 to 25 would be 10% from those numbers, right?
Correct. That's what that means. So the way I interpret that is that from 2023 onward, you get 90% of those amounts. From 2026 to 30, you get 70% of those amounts. And then 31 to 35, you get 40% of the tier 1 and tier 2 amounts. Does that make sense?
And that's the water year, the year we're in, it's at 100, but next year it was when these reductions started.
No, but I think their 90% is already built into the numbers on their tier 1 and tier 2. I can't remember. I think they took it off of their tier 1.
Yeah, the
not
number
their
that
tier
was
2.
the number that was in the memo was 2.9, and they reduced it to 2.7 to account for the 10%.
I got you. So it's really
Great question.
2022.
Reductions apply to all categories or just to tier 1
No,
and tier
just to
2?
tier 1 and tier 2. Your native is not reduced.
And in fact, as I recall, in East, they call native sustainable yield.
No, in greater they call it.
Greater. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Would it be possible for everybody on the committee to get a copy of this?
Yes, and what we're going to do is, so one of the reasons to go over this was to fill in gaps, correct? And also talking through this is helpful. Like I'm noticing water accounting rules should drop down below the fee, so we'll reorganize this so it flows kind of, but yeah, we'll get this to you in the next 48 hours.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Interestingly, though, if I,
And
like I
as
said,
of now in the greater, they did their rainfall's included in their total allocation. That may change, but that's where it is as of today.
Yeah, and I'll show you that I did, so that's what I just hid. There, when you get this, there will be even more detail in the sense that unhide, that you'll see things like rainfall, surface water credit,
See, so
groundwater
that
credit.
note, it's not allocated to the landowner in the greater right now. It's already part of their cap. I know
well,
some of
yeah,
their guys are pushing to track that, but that's not what their rules are set up
So
for
it's,
this year right
so
now.
it's anticipated, is it the anticipated rainfall?
I would say you got to leave that as because we don't know yet.
Great.
Yeah,
At the meeting yesterday, there
so still some confusion.
Great.
confusion as to how to show that correctly.
But I was just going to comment that when we say what's the difference between the different rules and regulations, emergency ordinance, largely the way I put this together was the way I went like flip a sheet, and they all, were very similar.
Yep. Is there anything worth mentioning about surface water credits, groundwater credits, recharge banking credits, recycle water?
It's I would just say that, we're all tracking surface water credits so that you get an offset. Groundwater credits are those generally that are carried over or transferred. So that's where the carryover and transfer.
Yep.
Recharge and banking is, those programs that individual landowners would set up, and we'll be tracking those separately for credits. And then recycled water is not your traditional ag recycled water, but the Greater Kaweah is considering, they've got some significant industry wastewater that gets shipped out to landowners that needs to be accounted for. So they're gonna have to track that.
And these, there are already placeholders for these in the water accounting dashboard. The fields may not be populated yet, but
They're
what's
there.
nice is it's already built into the water accounting dashboard.
And behind the scenes, the folks that are working on the water dashboard really are focusing right now on that surface water credit to make sure that it's up and running. So it says, I think, right now coming soon, but for everybody's knowledge, it's being connected right now as we speak.
Right, so now the accounting rules are important, especially because they impact how we understand the water market and its function. And so in terms of these various buckets that we just saw, so where they have them native yield and tier 1 or native yield tier 1 and tier 2, the accounting rules obviously matter. So let me do this so you can see the cap, the 3 buckets. And so accounting rules in Greater Kaweah, the landowner elects the priority of use, except for surface water, direct delivery, and precipitation, which comes directly out of the ET data. Now, where this is important is that it means that hypothetically an individual can say, well, the first 0.83 acre feet that I pumped was tier 1. I don't know why they would necessarily do this, but they could elect to pump tier 1 first, native yield second, for example, or native yield first, tier 1 second. And where that matters is it would affect what the fee structure is, how much they pay. And so obviously it seems rational that an individual would in almost every case pump the cheapest water first. The native yield is the $0 water, so that's the cheapest. But Greater does allow the individual landowner to elect priority, and they do this quarterly. So there will be a quarterly billing cycle this next year in Greater, where they report their usage and report what bucket that water was used out of, whether native tier 1 or tier 2. So that is in Greater.
So if you were to take all your water from tier 1 and then your carryover, your native, then tier 1 prices go up, but then you've got the carryover from native, which you paid nothing for. Is that right?
Yes, and so what's interesting there is this is a conversation we we're having yesterday in preparation for this call, is actually that say you only pump 1 acre foot and you elect that it's tier 2, you'll pay $250 an acre foot for that, and you'll carry over your tier 1 and your native, but you won't pay for it this year. So in the future, when you use it, they'll have to be tracking which bucket it came out of, how much you owe, and in some cases, you
And what
carry over.
year?
Right, and what year? Yep.
So why would, if I would have to pay, if I can carry it over, because it'd be, then if I was going to use new tier 2 water, then it would be more expensive potentially in years to come. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah,
That's
and
interesting.
plus they have losses in the Greater on both their native. You take a one-time 10% loss in the first year you carry it over, and then you don't lose any more for the next 4. I think on their tier 1 and tier 2, you have losses every year, right? As you carry it over.
No, well, I think it's you lose the 10% and then you're subject to the reductions in the, 70, 90, the reductions.
No, I
in the
think you can carry it over though, but I think they have I'll pull it up right now. They have losses
correct.
yearly
it's-
on their tiered water carryover. There's only a one-time loss on
on the carryover.
on the
native.
native carryover.
Yep.
And that highlights that there's another field that we need to add here, which is carryover losses.
I think it's down. I thought I added it in there. the carryover capabilities. Oh, I thought I had the 10% reductions.
That's fine.
Maybe I didn't.
This is a huge amount of information. So so we'll add carry over.
So it was identified yesterday that, yeah, so you're pointing out something, and that's grower by grower. So the three of you could have three different strategies, and then it's got to track vintage of water and the reduction per grower, per year, per category. And right now, I don't know that.
You lose 10% a year on tier 1 and tier 2. So by year 5, you've got 50% left of what you had in year 1.
So the dashboard has to be prepared to say, okay, it's 2024. What do I have? And it's got to do that all those permeations based on quarterly adjustments, because you could change it every quarter.
So by the way, so this is now, it makes perfect sense to me why the accounting rules, because we had been asking the question yesterday, why would someone ever change the priority and not pump the cheapest water first? And it's because in carried over years, you're going to need to be able to say which water from which tier in which year you're pumping. And so they do, because of the carryover rules, they need that. They do need that. It's going to be a count. So where this matters for the water market is that, every month that an auction is run, we need to know exactly what everyone has available for trade. We need to know what it is that they're trading, that it'll just be that 10 acres. But more importantly, as long as someone has the 10 acres, the 10 inches per acre, that's not a problem. So that doesn't seem like too big a task, but it sounds like you're going to have, the price signal is going to be muted in that there's all these different flavors of water with different prices attached to them.
Depending on what year it is and what they've changed that.
Correct. Yeah. So that will be interesting. So that is greater. So in mid automatically debits native first, tier 1 second, and tier 2 third. And more importantly, an important distinction here is that every year, each individual water user will pay the fees on the entire 2.5 acre feet, right? So they pay for it this year. If they don't use it, they can carry it over, but then they don't have to pay for it in the future. It's already been paid for, right? It's almost like, we were using bottles of wine yesterday. It's like buying a case of water bottles and putting it aside. You own it. You can use it when you want to in the future because it's already paid for. And so that is one simplification in the Mid-Kaweah that's attractive from the perspective of the water market, because.
And we identified that the water market, we need to be more flexible on the debiting side of things in order to accommodate that the market may want to not, because we're talking about native yield only. One of the discussions yesterday is should we say we're transferring or trading native yield, or should we just say we're transferring or allowing any 10 inches? Right. So remove the native yield criteria and just say we're allowing 10 inches. Now, what 10 inches, if it's native yield tier 1 or tier 2, it really, it's just 10 inches of water, because we know everybody has 10 inches.
So they pay it before they transfer it.
Well,
Depending on, if this.
Yes, but what we're yesterday when we talked about it, it's better that the committee may consider, instead of saying you can trade your native yield, you can say we are allowing the market to go up to 10 inches of water supply next year.
Right. So notice, so where this hits the ground is that as we've currently written the rules, we hadn't done this analysis of the allocation system. If we are saying, in fact, you can only trade your native yields, but native yield is the very first thing debited, that would mean that if somebody had already pumped 0.83 acre feet, they could not sell anything in the water market, right? Because we're debiting, they've already pumped their native yield, right? Whereas, hypothetically, under the greater Mid-Kaweah priority system where a person can designate, someone could say, oh, no, that 0.83 acre feet I pumped was tier 1. I'm going to pay, so charge me $160 an acre foot because I'm about to sell my native, right?
I don't get why Grader gets to do this. It's totally complicating everything beyond measure in terms of 10 inches versus how much that you're paid and what you've left. I mean, it's like, it seems like a scheme to just sort of confuse things because
Yeah, and where I worry about it is that I think there's going to be real confusion in the water accounting dashboard after the first year.
yeah,
It may be very difficult to sort out what's available, what isn't. So from the water market perspective, that's sort of my concern.
And I think, Sophie, that you just have to recognize that the Greater Kaweah Board has a different, landscape than both East and Mid and East don't match. And I think these are the rules and regulations that organization felt was going to get them to sustainability. But you're absolutely right, and Matthew's right. We're not sure how the water dashboard is going to incorporate some of these things.
Whether there's a market or not, actually.
Correct. Yeah,
But then now adding the complexity of the market will make it even harder. So
but doesn't the basin have to have some, continuity? This changes.
I think that's always been the intent.
There'd be continuity, but we don't have it here.
I think it's challenging.
So where does that, you and I were in the meeting yesterday, and certainly they have a perspective and their growers are, I would say, quite outspoken. Is that fair to say? And I don't know where the conversation happens when Sigma says you've got to look at this as a basin-wide basin, and yet we're looking at this completely differently in terms of how you're going to become sustainable. Where does that get discussed? You just leave it to DWR to decide whether or not you're all together, or where does that happen?
We're probably traipsing into the issues that are outside of the water marketing strategy, but
It's affecting the water marketing strategy, though.
it is, but it isn't, because at the point at which the Greater Kaweah would have to consider implementing a water mark, again, this is just a recommendation. When we get this document, and if the document says this is what the committee recommends and it doesn't fit with the Greater Kaweah, then the Greater Kaweah board will have to kind of say, okay, wait, do we adjust the rules and regulations to match the water marketing strategy, or do we adjust the water marketing strategy to match the rules and regulations? And what probably will come to light is you can't adjust the water marketing strategy because there's a very thoughtful discussion about how this is going to work. So at that point, the rules and regulations will have to adjust. But I'm just forecasting, and I don't know. I just know that some of these rules, as I was writing them down, if you look at my notes, I was like, well, and I'm not in the, I'm trying to keep up to speed with the water dashboard, but James is our point person on that. So he and I talk regularly, so I'm trying to keep up. And a lot of my comments were, I don't think the water dashboard team can do this, right? If they had 10 years and a whole bunch of programmers, you can do anything, but they cannot do this within 365 days. And they're going to need to put these rules in 365 days. If not sooner, because everybody's going to want to know where am I at in my allocations. So
and that's something too. By the way, this is where I think water markets can play a really positive role. Like in our neighborhood, they had tried to implement telemetry for years, but the minute you had the water market strategy, it made it feasible, right? So here, the accounting rules will be a barrier to implementing a water market, which might create an incentive to simplify them, right? Who knows? So that's a possible outcome. So I do want to point out, though, that whereas Mid-Kaweah's is much more straightforward, there is still a challenge in that, as we had currently discussed, as we had been discussing the rules, if we said you can only trade native and we debit native first, that means anyone who's pumped more than 10 inches cannot sell water, even though the cap is 2.5. And so what I was going to propose to the committee is that we modify the way we've been thinking about that, is that you can sell an amount equivalent to your native yield, but it's not actually your native yield. So So I would propose that we modify how we've been talking about this and think of it in terms of you may sell 10 inches conditional on you're under the 2.5 acre foot cap. Right. So for example, if you pumped 0.83, you can sell the second 10 inches, recognizing that you're first going to have to pay $160 an acre foot. So the sale price is going to need to be above 160, or else you're not going to sell it. Right. For that matter, you could pump 20 inches yourself and still sell 10, but you would only consider doing that if the price is above $210 an acre foot, because you're going to have to pay $210 before you sell it. And that seems like there's what's nice is that the fee structure imposes a kind of price signal in itself, and that it means transfers will happen in those higher tiers only when people really need it, right? When they're willing to pay a high price. And so there will be an item later. So park that suggestion now, but I wanted to ask the committee to consider just reframing that slightly. We're not going to trade native yield. We're going to trade 10 inches conditional on being under your cap. So you would not, if you have to have 10 inches left under the cap. So then East Kaweah is different in that they're only allocating native in tier 1. So that's 1.15. And then someone can pay the penalty tier to pump up to 2.5 feet, or can secure transfers. But even securing transfers or paying the penalty, they may not exceed 2.5, as I understand.
Craig, did I get that right? Tier 1 is $500 too by default?
Yep, that's what we approved, and even after last night, it stayed the same. There was no change. So
And there is no tier 2, right?
not this year. There was last year that may have some carryover with it with some people, but for the most part, yeah, there's no tier 2 this current water year we're now in.
And Craig, so what would happen if somebody pumped 2.6 feet? They will
Well,
have
say they had transfers all the way up to 2.5, right? And then they physically pumped an extra 0.1. So you're gonna have 0.1 times $500 and lose 0.1 from next year.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Great.
But rainfall's in there, so if we get any kind of normal rainfall, it's gonna be hard unless you're really pumping a bunch of water to
Exceed that,
go
sure.
too much above that, unless you're
Okay.
double or triple cropping, or you've got,
Yep.
something other than citrus.
Okay, but they may not secure transfers for 2.6, right? Their transfer limit would be capped at 2.5, correct?
Well, I think you could secure all the water, but even if you got a bunch of credits on your account, you're physically capped at 2.5.
Okay,
You
so
take your-
you'd have to carry it
you
over.
carry it
Okay,
over
cool.
again.
Yeah,
Yep,
that
yep.
makes sense.
That
Yeah.
makes sense.
Good, okay.
And
Excellent.
then on the accounting rules, you've got it listed right. The only difference is, and I don't know if it's caveated on when the dashboard allows, or even if in this last year, the way the rules are written, they can choose, like if you had a surface water delivery in July, the landowner can actually say, no, that's my native yield I used, even though I had surface water, and keep
Oh, okay.
his surface water credit.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. But again, they wouldn't necessarily be changing the priority of native or tier 1, correct?
No, if the landowner doesn't choose, that's the default priority.
Yep. Okay. Great. All right, so any other comments or questions? This is I think this is sort of the hardest part to wrap your head around. So we're kind of deep in this.
You can imagine my ears there was blood coming out of my ears trying to put this together and understand it. And I realized
Exactly. Performed a service to humanity.
Yeah, I was like, Scott, the guy putting our water dashboard together, needs to see this because he'll probably quit.
No, he doesn't need to see this yet.
There's been a lot of questions on the Mid-Kaweah, and that mitigation tier, what is it not? What does it allow? What does it not allow? So for everybody's understanding on the Mid-Kaweah's mitigation block, that is, if you go over the 2.5, there's a recognition that the landowner will pay to replace it. That means we're trying to net 0 over 2.5 over time. It may not happen in 1 year, it could happen in the future. So if you go over an acre foot, my job is to bring 1 acre foot or more back into the subbasin. However, if you don't, it comes off the tiers in the future so that you should net a cap of 2.5.
So in other words, someone can pump up to 3.5. And if you can find the water, they'll pay 260, not 500.
Correct.
Okay. Sounds reasonable. All right, so in terms of carryover, what you see here is that water from any of the 3 buckets can be carried over. So native yield or sustainable yield, as it's called in greater tier 1 or tier 2, can be carried over if you received that allocation and it remains unpumped.
Oh, you can see I forgot to put the 10% reduction on that. Because see on
Well,
mine, on the
we can fill out the carryover losses category in a second.
Okay.
Great. Great. And then you mentioned here that there's a maximum of 5 years. Are there maximums on any of the others?
It's for
Yeah.
the native, the tier 1, tier 2, it's all 5 years, first in, first out.
And then I think Greater
And no
Kaweah,
losses on the carryover.
and I think Greater Kaweah has a 5-year limit plus a reduction in the first year.
Yeah, on the native, and then the tier 1 and tier 2 have reductions every year.
Okay, sorry. So Greg, when you were talking earlier about carryover losses, where native yield was reduced 10% one time, and then
No, that's in the
10%.
great, that's in the greater.
That's
In the
greater,
east,
okay.
in the east, it's no losses, total of 5 years. There's some losses on, or there's some different rules around the transfer deal, but as far as the carryover losses for the East Kaweah, there is 0 losses. On the greater, native is 10% one time after the first year, and then you get to carry it for 5 total. Tier 1 and tier 2 are 10% each year you carry it.
okay, and then so in greater, is it also 5 years or it's
Yep.
10 years?
I'm looking right now. I think it's just 5 years.
I think it's 5 years.
Okay, and
Yep,
then
that's it. So first day of the 6 water year, you're out. It's gone.
okay, and it's first in, first out.
Yep.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, I guess they can pick any.
Yeah,
any
it
they
is.
want, but
Actually, in theirs, no, because they can
No,
choose the priority.
correct.
They can
It's
choose
not
the
first
priority.
in, first
Yeah.
out.
we can choose 2 as far as that goes, but
Well,
realistically, you're not
theoretically,
gonna,
you can choose in
you're
the east,
not
but
as an
like,
owner, you're not gonna make sure you're gonna make sure you're using the oldest water before you lose it, right?
No loss. So in east, it's no loss on native. Tier
or
1
anything.
is 10%.
No,
no,
tier 1 and
loss
tier,
on-
no loss on anything.
A 5-year maximum. That's what it.
The only caveat is if you transfer tier 1 or tier 2, you have, whoever you transfer it to, it has to be used in that current water year.
Yeah.
Transfer of tier 1 and tier 2 cannot be carried over by whoever you transfer it to. It has to be
Yeah.
you.
Okay, and that's another question for the committee will be, can water you purchase in the market, can it be carried over? And East might say, no, we're going to treat it like any other groundwater credit, it has to be used in the year. So anyway, that'll be a question. That's another question we'll address at the end.
That's why the flavor is gonna be important on
Yeah.
what you're moving.
And Craig, the way I understood the way the rules and regulations are, you can choose your categories. However, only when it can be accommodated. So Mike recognized that the water dashboard may not be able to do it. So you can't allow it till it can be tracked.
Well, I mean, right now it's a paper transfer form into the East Kaweah, so realistically, Mike's gonna, I mean, what we just laid out last night on the timeline, he's gonna have a bunch of paper transfer requests come in after the end of this year, because we're gonna give, I think, all the landowners about 30 days to get their full report with their ET, native, rainfall, all that stuff. And then give them 30 days to go try and make transfers if they don't want to get a bill.
Well, no, but the picking the categories like of how you burn the water is not available yet.
Not on the dashboard, that's right. So it would probably default to the priority list, but
Yeah.
we haven't
Okay.
really had that deep of a discussion on that yet, because our rules say you could pick the category. So how that works without the dashboard, I don't know.
So Mid-Kaweah, tell me again what the. carryover loss is.
100% carryover on everything, but we understand and we'll be discussing that, you know, what the,
Because yours is emergency ordinance, right?
yeah,
Okay.
and where the common thought is 10% with a 5-year max.
Okay, and there's no max currently.
No,
Okay, all right. And then, great, so that's very helpful. So those are carryovers, right? And then now we're gonna talk about non-market, I'm gonna write non-market transfers here. So each GSA has provision for transferring allocation of one sort or another. In the case of greater, using a transfer form, you can transfer sustainable yield. So that's AKA native, and the other two, tier 1, tier 2, and groundwater credits. So groundwater credits would be carryover generated from a previous year.
so that was one of the key things that I pointed out to the grader. They've used the terminology sustainable yield, which is confusing the heck out of everybody. What is that?
What's ironic is though, I think you step outside, I don't know about the Central Valley, but in coastal California, that's what they would call native. So
Correct.
So that language is more.
Well, no, that's what we call it too, native.
No, my point is, what you call native, we would call sustainable.
Okay, yeah.
Under Sigma, sustainable yield is defined in the code as that amount of water that's available for beneficial use, as long as it doesn't trigger undesirable results. So the use of that term is more consistent with Sigma than is native yield.
But not how we use it.
Right, yeah. So here, so though you may transfer those things in greater, and there are some transfer restrictions. First, and again, this one we'll have to think about quite a bit in the context of the water market, is that they have a directional restriction that sustainable yield or native can be transferred no further than 3 analysis zones. There is a leave behind. So when you transfer, there's an exchange rate depending on how far you transfer it. So if it's within your zone, there's no transfer loss. If you go over 2 zones, there's a 10% loss, 3 zones, 20% loss. So that's for the sustainable or native yield. For tiered water, if you transfer this by submitting a transfer form, 80% of tier 1 and 60% of tier 2 can be transferred within 3 zones. And then you see here, further elaborating on that, if you go 1 zone, it's 80%. If you go over 1 zone, it's 80%. And adjacent zone, sorry, if it's within zone, it's that 80% that we just mentioned. If you transfer it over a zone, you only get 70. If you go over 2 zones, it's only 60%, 3 zones, 30%, et cetera. And there's a similar provision for tier 2. So in terms of the accounting, and imagine this is layered on top of the complexity we discussed above, in terms of accounting for how much you've pumped this year, what you've pumped and what you've carried over. There's also these exchange rates on transfers of non-market transfers of pumping. Where that will have to be accounted for, right? How far you're transferring it will result in so you'll have to debit 100% the person transferring it out, and the person transferring it in may only get 10%, between 10% and 80%, depending on how far away they are. Mid-Kaweahs, obviously, it's quite a bit simpler. Theirs transfers are only authorized within common ownership and within 5 miles. And so these are simple. Someone creates an account in the water accounting dashboard and manages that account as common ownership. One question I have about that is, what if someone has 2 APNs that are more than 5 miles apart? Are they prohibited from creating an account with those?
They're not
two?
prohibited from creating an account. They just can't transfer that from that distance. And sure enough, with most people, they always had a parcel within 5 miles. We haven't run into one yet.
Okay. Or it's more than that. Okay. Because I do wonder, because my understanding of the dashboard is it's not accounting for transfers within accounts. It doesn't say, oh, I transferred the puppy for this one.
It's one big bucket. Yep.
Right.
And
Okay.
we weren't, the first year, we're not really, because we're one big square block, it was not going to be a big issue. Right. And most of the folks we talked to that had that situation, they actually run 2 separate operations.
Yeah.
Because they're too far apart to operate as one operation.
Yeah. So notice, so as it currently stands, that's not actually necessarily a binding constraint. Not necessarily. Okay.
So yesterday at the Greater Kaweah, they were talking about different zones and transferring between different zones. And could you just do that if it was the same ownership? And, people were saying, hey, if I'm out of water here, I want to transfer that sustainable yield or native over to this other one because I need it there and I'm allowed it even if I don't have it.
Yeah.
And
They can, but that goes through that filter. Right.
Oh, so that's a question I had, is that I was assuming that all of these restrictions are for transfers between unrelated parties.
Oh, good point.
I think my assumption is that
the way the rules read, that's for anybody related or not.
related or not. Okay, so the water accounting dashboard definitely can't handle
I
that.
know it's going to blow up.
Yeah, so that might be manageable between accounts, but that's going to be a challenge. Okay, if it's common ownership and you have to do that transfer. Okay, interesting. All right, now and then in the East Kaweah, you'll have to tell me, Craig, what transitional pumping is, because I didn't see that anywhere above.
Well, that's any of the tier 1 or tier 2, you can carry it over for 5 years. If you keep it, the second you transfer it, it's got to be used in that current water year. So
would it be accurate if I
whoever's receiving the transfer has to use that water in that year.
Yeah.
Or they
Cool.
lose
Yeah.
it. They can't carry it over.
Yeah, so right here, if I erase transitional pumping that's carried, if I just write transferred groundwater credit must be used within the allocation.
But only
years,
only tier 1 and tier 2 native can be carried over by whoever you transfer it to. But the tier 1 or tier 2 cannot. It's got to be used.
I get it. That's what you mean by transitional pumping. I'm just
Yeah.
going to write tier 1, tier 2 because that's what it says above.
Yep.
that makes a lot of sense to me.
Great, excellent. But native can be carried over if it's transferred. Okay, well, that's actually it.
You carry it over for 5 years, is that right?
Yeah, so someone can hang on to their tier water for 4 years and then move it in the last year, but whoever they move it to,
Okay.
whether it's year 1 or year 4, has to use it in that year.
Okay, so this now makes sense to me. When I had seen in Greater and East that a water user might specify a certain priority, I didn't quite understand. Now it makes perfect sense why if you just bought somebody's tier 2, you're going to want to pump that this year, even if you have native. So I get it now. That's great. All right.
Just to keep it from, what I was concerned about is just kicking the can down the road. So you transfer it and then you transfer and then do they get 5 years again? Or,
You
you
would reset the clock,
No,
right? I don't-
the 5 years follows the year the water was allocated, so.
I'm good with that.
And that does mean this becomes a pretty interesting. So in all three, ultimately in all three GSAs, you'll have to know the age of the water, which is can be a challenge. So here, so this is one that we'll talk about either later this afternoon or at a future meeting. Is we'll need to talk through these transfer restrictions because you have three different approaches here. And the question is, for example, in greater, would it make sense to have totally different market transfer restrictions than the ones that are here, right? We talked about these triggers, which is a much simpler restriction. Is it appropriate to have less restrictive transfer rules in the market than out of the market? The flip side is also true. Does it make sense to have, my experience in water markets is you really, if there's market and non-market transfers, you really want the same rules to apply to all transfers. Otherwise, people will be looking to game whichever is the easier system when it fits them, so that's something we'll have to address. And then the other one too is a question I have for water users, potential market participants is, if you have these two systems, a system of market transfers, a system of non-market, I'd like to sort of develop some intuition on when are you likely to use one or the other, right? And for example, if the answer is, well, I'm almost always going to use the non-market transfers, are there going to be so few transactions that it's not worth doing a formal market in that case? That's a fundamental question. You'll recall the gentleman from Australia had said, no, I would really start with one and only one first and learn and do it. So that's a question that we'll have to address. So that'll come up later. So any questions? Actually, let me make one more comment about transfer approval, and then I'm curious if people have questions or comments. In terms of transfer approval, so there is a transfer form in the grader, and they have an additional rule that approval requires that all fees have been paid. So recall that in the grader, you don't pay for water until you use it, even if you're carrying it over. Whereas in mid, you pay for all 2.5 acre feet every year, and then you can pump it at some time in the future. And so they have to make sure that the fee has actually been paid before it's transferred to somebody else. And so there's a form that would be approved by agency staff. In Mid-Kaweah, there is no form. If you have an account in the water accounting dashboard, then you can make those adjustments within your account. It's automatically tracked in the water dashboard because they're not allowing transfers between properties that are not under common ownership. And then here it says East Kaweah, all transfers will be subject to final review and approval by East Kaweah GSA. Craig, do you know, is that the board? Is that agency staff? Is that an executive officer? Do you know who?
I think it falls with the executive director.
Great.
But, I think it depends on the type of transfer as to whether or not he's gonna use the technical committee or some other consultant to help him approve or deny.
Okay, and then is there a standard transfer form, and does that exist? Will there?
I think he has a form. I haven't even seen it yet, but I think Mr. Hagman does have a form that he's given out to people.
Great. Okay, excellent. All right, so are there any comments or questions about these transfers? So 3 different approaches. All right.
Chuck, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I guess I have a general comment. There's farming in both Mid-Kaweah and Greater Kaweah. The characteristics in the East Kaweah, the characteristics of the districts are quite a bit different. We all know that. greater is mostly row crops and mostly no surface water. They're going to have a greater need and utilization of transfer probably because they have the ability to not plant, where East, I think, is mostly permanent crops. Don't have a whole lot of ability there. And Mid-Kaweah is somewhere in the middle. And there's been, a fair amount of disparaging of Greater Kaweah's approach here. And I've not been part of any of those discussions, and I agree with that to a great degree, that they're kind of marching to a different drummer than East and Mid-Kaweah are. But you also have to look at a little bit from the perspective of the growers there, where they don't have any surface water, and their livelihoods, they may be losing 30–40% of their ability to produce a livelihood. So they're pretty passionate about it. Now, that being said, I don't see any reason when we go about developing this model, we have to do anything at all to incorporate, the Gettysburg Address that has been written there. I think you come up with rules that are doable, and then if Greater Kaweah wants to adopt them, they adopt them. If not, you're still going to get a good test market this year between Mid-Kaweah and East Kaweah, and you also get another model, which is this non-market transfer in Greater Kaweah. So you might learn more things doing it that way than trying to cram all the square pegs into round holes.
Well said. Any other comments or questions? Oh, we have another hand raised. Colin?
Yeah, a question. I don't know if you guys went over it, but carryover on surface water credits.
So from my perspective, and only from the Mid-Kaweah, surface water credits are debited against ET by default. So there's no carrying over of surface water credits because they show up. If you have theoretically a surface water credit, it's showing up as in the category as groundwater credit for recharge. There's no such thing as a surface water credit in the Mid-Kaweah. I think there theoretically is one in the East Kaweah.
There is, because you could have the surface water credits come up, choose that you used your native, and you'll have a surface water credit carry on your books. And there is not, the argument now is there's not a time limit on the carryover credit of a surface water credit.
Yeah, because that has a longer.
There's few and far between of the districts that would physically have that credit on their account for more than 5 years.
And the way I
my
understood
district's
that,
probably the only one that would.
so the way I understood that, Craig, was theoretically you could shift and say, like this year, I pumped that, and yet I'm going to reserve it as a surface water credit for next year, right? And say I ET an acre foot next year, but I meet that ET with groundwater, but theoretically off the books, it's a surface water credit.
Yeah,
That's the way
you're basically pumping your in lieu water from the previous year now in the current year, right?
Yeah. The problem that Mike and I were talking about is what happens if there's physically no water there. You thought you had it, and then physically it's not there.
Yep. Or your MTs or your MTs are below, and now you can't pump your credits anyway.
Yeah, and Mike and I came to the conclusion is like, at this point, everybody's taking that risk internally. So the risk factor almost removes the surface water credit swap situation. You're going to try and apply the surface water credit in the year that you use it to try and leave the groundwater there.
And most of the irrigation districts are gonna not allow surface water credits to go anywhere but in their irrigation district.
That's true.
So it's really only gonna be crediting around the district itself. I'm probably gonna end up telling my guys, just show your surface water as against your ET, Because your native water that will be the credit, even though it's got a 5-year term on it, you can move it wherever you want without the district having any say-so in it.
Yeah, you got more flexibility. Yep.
Yeah.
Colin, did that help any?
Yeah, so I guess to surmise that basically where I'm going with this is for like a ditch stock or a ditch company, like conveyance loss, that would all go under groundwater credit. Is that right?
Yes. That we're setting up, James, loss of channels is getting set up to the groundwater credit.
But it's gonna be a groundwater credit from appropriated supply though, so it's gonna still have a different flavor of it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so one other thing that is noted here in the matrix is that the 3 GSAs do anticipate transfers between GSA. Thus far, the graders rules specify only native yield can be transferred or what they call sustainable yield. In the
And
east,
they also, I think, have to have approval of the other GSA it's going to.
I imagine, yeah. Okay, great. In East Kaweah, allow native to transfer between GSAs upon approval of East. I assume you also need the approval of the other.
Yep.
Great. And then since transfers are only within accounts in the water accounting dashboard, Mid-Kaweah specifies that these would only be allowed between common ownership. So accounts between GSAs. You know, you'll recall when we saw the water accounting dashboard, it showed the same account in the account summary. It had one for mid, one for greater. So hypothetically, you could move. Are there any limitations on how much can be moved?
No, but it's just come up that there's folks that may be way away.
Yeah.
That's we probably have to figure out. Again, we would amend that through a policy in the GSP.
Okay.
Not the GSP, the emergency ordinance.
Okay, and then just so you know, too, the one thing I'd be worried about is that and this is mitigated in part because we're only allowing 10 inches, but you'd also be worried about, you know, someone who has
Wholesale.
greater and mid transferring all their pumping into, like say mid adopts a market and greater doesn't, transferring all of it into mid so they could sell it.
Somewhere else.
And now you're increasing pumping in mid.
Yeah.
But again, that's mitigated in part by the 10 inches. So Chuck.
Yeah, Aaron, on that allowed between common ownership, is that inside the Mid-Kaweah, it's 5 miles. Would that be the same restriction or has that not been addressed?
I would say by the rules, it would be that 5 mile. Yeah, but our goal there was to allow flexibility on the edges there. That's what we were trying to do.
Although again, that presumes that you would need the accounting dashboard
To swap it over.
and to know when it's, well, I guess all you would need to have is 2 APNs less than 5 miles apart. And it's going to let you do it.
Correct.
Any two, right? You could also
Yeah,
have
but-
ones that are.
But Scott actually, in discussions with the water, when you look at your water dashboard, you see your Greater Kaweah land and your Mid-Kaweah and your East Kaweah. There's 3 blocks.
Yeah.
So it's 3 codes, 3 different databases.
Yeah.
So if you do want to move between GSAs, there has to be a physical, they're not looked at as one big bucket.
Okay.
Yeah, they're physically moving it different, I think.
So, okay, so it's not as simple then as someone. So it's not as simple as someone can't just do this without GSA oversight in the accounting dashboard because it's 3 different codes.
I think, yes.
Okay.
And Chuck, you're right. It's not, we don't make it GSA specific. If I remember right, the idea was to allow some flexibility at the edges there. So,
Okay.
So this one, then I'm going to just put a question mark next to this, but there's some details missing.
one of the great things I think what Matthew was talking about is this exercise highlighted where, again, like what I'm taking the Mid-Kaweah, some of these things are going to need to be incorporated into our rules and regulations.
All right, dairy tracking. Some of this was less, I thought less relevant to the water market per se, but so I'm not going to necessarily go over all of this, but let me know if you want to talk about dairy tracking, fallow field tracking.
Fallow field has an important role in the water market because of the fact that a fallow field has the ability, right? That so if you fallow the field, you're going to get the 2.5 acre feet and you're only going to be able to move 10 right now. Right. So there's not a lot of incentive to do the fallow field right now. If you're trying to market it, if you're trying to move it within your transfer, you're fine.
Yeah, great. Okay. So what this allows, so explain then how this works in Mid-Kaweah.
So we ran into the situation where we had growers this year that wanted to fallow their fields, but we were going to charge them whatever the ET was tracking. So we had fields that were showing a lot of ET, and Land IQ admitted that the fallow field is the most inaccurate reading they have. And so they were going to say, well, if you're going to charge me that inaccurate reading, then I'm just going to grow because I'm actually going to be using my allocation to make product. And so we said, well, I'll be very honest. So we talked to Lower Tule and their process, and we adopted something I would say almost identical. We might have tweaked it a little bit, but if you fallow it, you agree to leave it fallow, agree to keep it under certain conditions, and you get your full credit.
And that's generating a groundwater credit. Okay, and I assume it's
well. It just means you don't get dinged ET.
Yeah.
So you retain your native.
So you pay your 2.5. You pay for all 2.5 acre feet, and you carry over all 2.5. Yep. Okay. I assume too that would help because I remember one of the concerns you expressed early on, Sophie, was that there's an issue on how they treat that ground when it's fallow, right? And you don't want to discourage them from putting a cover crop down. Does that interface with that?
Correct. It has requirements to maintain that field, including cover crop potential.
Okay, cool. Okay, but they'll still get the full 2.5. Okay, great. All right. Anything about surface water reporting, banking recharge programs? So I'll let you look at that.
We're working on the surface water reporting. How's that?
Okay.
Most of the irrigation district are not set up to report it by parcel. That's been the difficulty.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yep. Whereas it will have to be reported by parcel in the water accounting dashboard because there'll be surface water credits, right? By parcel.
Yeah. We're looking at models within our 2 ditch companies where we collect the losses, we assess those losses across the shares. So the landowner has the shares, and then we can apply that loss to the bucket, but not to the parcel.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay, cool. All right. Monitoring. This is not as relevant to the water market per se as some of the earlier discussion, but new wells in Greater Kaweah must register with a meter within 30 days. And landowner can choose between meter or ET. If the landowner doesn't make a choice that defaults to ET, there's a question then about, well, if they want to report on metering, how does that get converted into an ET calc for the dashboard? Because the dashboard is ET based, but there's a formula for that. Whereas in Mid and East, it will simply be ET based for the time being. All 3 are using the water accounting dashboard. And then there's a protest process and associated resolution process.
That's going to make it easy for people to game this process. If we farm on both sides of Mid-Kaweah and Greater Kaweah, I could sign up for meters in Greater Kaweah and then run wells out of Mid-Kaweah where they're using ET, and who's the wiser? That's not a water marketing problem. That's a problem with the system as it exists here.
The dashboard carve those into 2 different accounts.
Yes.
Okay.
But what he's saying is the physical nature of where you get the water from.
Yeah.
That was always the argument to use the meter.
Oh, I understand, because the point is you could pump it on one side of the GSA boundary and apply it on the other side. Oh, okay, of course. Yeah.
It's a real fuzzy line.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, interesting. Oh, wow.
Now, net sum, whether, yeah, if you were to pump it on one side of the line, Mid-Kaweah, and pump it 5 miles away, you're probably going to have impacts. And I would say that that's not unrealistic in certain circumstances where you have people that are connected in over very long distances, and you can, I mean, physically, that's a big lift from a power and pump and facility. But I mean, I know we have some dairymen that move water about 2 miles away. Right.
Wow.
But 5 miles is pretty extreme, but it can be overcome.
So that's the detail that we have on the 3 allocation systems. So first of all, so I want to invite any additional comments or questions about any aspect of the allocation matrix. Also, is there any information that you would like to learn about these 3 allocation systems that's not presented here? So any and all of those questions, comments, things you'd like, additional things you'd like to know. Colin, please.
I appreciate you going through this. I feel less stupid now.
I have a question on whether or not a dairy facility will be counted as irrigated acres or not, if it's receiving that, or if it's getting charged that 0.5 acre feet per acre. Is it gonna have tiered water associated with it available? Or is
Yes.
it the same?
Well, the two, I think I was talking with Mike, I think he has a total of 4 dairies in his entire GSA. So I think he's working with each dairyman. So I don't know the model there, but I believe if you take the Four Creeks model, speaking for the Mid-Kaweah, you would get the 2.5 over the dairy footprint.
Yeah, will you explain for everyone's benefit, because you did it, I had to hear it in detail. What is the issue that dairies raise in the context of ET remote sensing? Why are they dairies hard, and why do they need this extra?
Well, because when you see from a satellite imagery, all you see is a bunch of tin roofs. So you can't measure anything. So
So
what,
it records no evapotranspiration.
no, it sees some of it.
Okay, but very little.
Yeah, I mean, you've got, you know, you can see the corrals and the other things, but the facilities, you don't really see the image because they got the big long sheds that cover, but so it's a very inaccurate reading.
Okay.
And then you've got the dairy. So the physical pumping of groundwater on the dairy footprint has a whole bunch of cooling water, wash water, drinking water, all these various different things that are, if you read the Four Creeks report, I mean, it's a mind-boggling exercise. We started going down that road with a couple large dairymen and realized that each one is doing it even differently from there. But if we could create a model that kind of took the extremes and made an average for now, that average showed that they would use physically remove, they pump way more, but they remove about 0.5 acre feet per acre. Whatever else the 2.5 we're
Goes
sending
back.
out goes back into the ground or out to the field.
Okay. And so are they paying for 0.5 or are they paying for 2.5?
2.5. In the Mid-Kaweah, they pay for the 2.5. I don't, so in the greater Kaweah, because they don't pay for the allocation, they pay as they burn the ET.
Yep.
It's somewhat muted. It's gonna get mixed in and you're not gonna see it because it'll be in the field.
Yep. Okay. Yep. So again, so the way I understand it, say you had a parcel that was half cropping and half dairy. The problem would be that you would understate the water use on the half that's the dairy.
Yep.
And
Well, so
you need a rule of thumb. Well, it's about a half acre feet for that. They still get the 2.5, which they could then pump and use on the adjacent property, on the adjacent crops.
yeah, if you had a dairy facility that was 100 acres with cows on it, then that would get 250 acre feet of allocation. We would deduct 50 off that.
That's what they're using, assumed to use on site.
And then 200 acre feet would be recycled back out to meet ET in the nearby fields.
Yeah. Right, great. Excellent.
And there's a study that USDA, I think, is funding to true up that 0.5.
Okay.
Yeah, so over time, we'll get better.
And it will necessarily always just be a rule of thumb for dairies. You're averaging across dairies.
Yeah, I think it's the easiest way for right now, but we may get down to, I know a few of our dairymen are looking at, well, maybe I ought to just start metering. They had meters. They just didn't have a plethora of meters so that they knew that they had one meter that was sending water out to a specific use, but I had 3 pipelines on that use. So you don't know where it went.
Excellent, good question. Thanks, Colin. Anything else? Comments or questions about the details you see here? Things you'd like us to add, information you'd like us to go learn?
Want to absorb.
Yeah. So again, how this will be used is I will do one more pass. I'm gonna rearrange, we have made additions to the document now as we've been working. And so I'll just move some things around so that it follows, so that it's I'll try and make it so it's clear which issues are more important to the function of a water market, and that the flow follows how we talked it through it. And we'll get this out to you here this week. From my perspective, the 2 things that have the strongest implications for the design of water market are the non-market transfers and potential effects on market activity. And then the other one is the accounting, right? How much do you have? How much does it cost? Because what's interesting in this case is that, someone is paying for, and just to give you a sense, I'm aware of other water markets where the way this works is that if you transfer pumping, you don't ever pay a fee for the pumping. The person receiving the water pays the fee. Whereas here, it's a little different. You actually pay the fee for the water, and then you sell it to someone and they get to use it without paying the fee, right? And so the accounting matters, right? And what those fees are, 160, 210, all of that affects the value of water. And what we're really trying to do is put a price on water and learn what the value of water is. And so the accounting becomes pretty important. So with that, let me go back to our slides. Make sure I'm on the correct. Yeah. All right. So that was, first of all, I want to acknowledge that was pretty heavy. Oh my goodness. We were, felt like we were treading water there for an hour and a half. So thanks for working through the details of that. I think it is really important to understand all this in the context of what we're doing. And so for the rest of today, I'm not super ambitious that we need to accomplish a lot more, because I think what we just did was important, and having a chance to process that information and refine it is important. But so I just want to ask these questions, and so I don't think we need to make any decisions today, but these are just sort of treat these as prompts. If you have any additional comments that we should register today, or questions. After looking at the allocation matrix, one of the questions I have is, what will the effect of these non-market transfers be on the function of the market? And in particular, I was thinking when I asked that question about the restrictions on transfers, right? Does there need to be an alignment? On the restrictions on transfers. And again, we have imagined this trigger system. I do think part of our strategy should be a recommendation that the same rules apply to non-market and market transfer. So that's my recommendation. At some point, I'd like you to think about, and I'll ask the committee, do you agree that our water marketing strategy document should recommend that restrictions on transfers be uniform, whether they're happening in the formal market or not? So
that is, just so I'm clear, that's a question between the formal market auction and the back of the truck transfer.
Right.
Not, I own 1,000 acres and I need to move it around where I need to.
No, that's That's the accounting dashboard, right? Yeah, so I'm talking about these transfers where you're going to transfer between non-common ownership, and you'll have a choice of either submitting agreeing at the coffee shop, the amount, the price, and then submitting the transfer form, just that informal transfer, or the market transfer. And we have this interesting situation in particular where actually right now, as it's currently envisioned, the restrictions are actually even more complex and greater than they would be in the market that we're designing, right? So that's something to think about. Accounting rules. So by the way, jump in at any time, raise your hand or just unmute and talk. In terms of accounting rules, we have this issue of debit. Are we debiting native first? If so, what does that mean for transfers? Are we actually trading native, or are we simply limiting an individual's amount that can be transferred to 10 inches per acre? So what's the debiting order does the water user choose? And when is it paid for? These are all accounting issues that matter. And again, I heard Chuck real clearly when he said we don't have to take into consideration some of the more complex accounting rules. We can say this is how we're doing it, and maybe even then run an experiment, because one, it reduces the likelihood of the market being adopted in one particular GSA. We can also make a recommendation, right? That for the water market to function, we recommend this accounting standard. So anyway, so that's something to think about. So that's the first line there, accounting rules. We need to think about those accounting rules and how it would affect function of the market. And so with that, I want to ask the question now. Again, we don't have to answer it today, but I'll bring this question back. Do we want to continue saying that what we're going to trade is native yields? Because if so, it will, by the current accounting rules, it will exclude almost everyone from ever having water to sell. Or do we simply want to say we're going to limit what someone can sell to 10 inches, conditional on that they're under their cap, whether that's 2.5, 2.7, or 1.15. Right, so think about that. And then this is another fundamental question, can purchased water be carried over as a groundwater credit if it goes unused? Or do we want to have something like East has, which is if you're doing a transfer between unrelated parties, they need to use it that year. And so again, let's not make a decision, but we haven't, I'm curious what people think about that. Do we want to simply say, no, it generates a groundwater credit, it'll be subject to the same carryover rules as Carryover, or do we want a rule like in East that says, no, if you're going to buy it, you're going to use it this year? Do folks have preliminary thoughts?
First thought is it keeps it simpler if you have to use it in that first year, and it probably takes a lot of the little sideways out of it of how far have I carried it over, and now, I'm a mega groundwater purveyor because I have saved all this water.
And I also think growers, and I'd love to hear growers respond to what I'm about to say, but it seems that growers would still have flexibility in the sense that it just means that's what we debit first, right? They can still carry over other water, so it's not like they're losing the ability to carry something over. We're just saying it's the first thing debited, it expires first. So and there is a simplicity in that. Any other thoughts?
I think that makes the most sense. There's enough complexity in the system already. If you can have any hard and fast rules, it seems like that it would be a reasonable one.
Okay. All right. So we'll revisit that, especially when we have a larger quorum of committee members. And then a question I have is, can the accounting system update quickly enough to support market trades? And what I mean by that is actually, I'm curious to learn what's the frequency that these other non-market transfers to be approved and updated in the dashboard. we've talked right now about doing monthly auctions. Well, monthly auctions will hinge on the water use data, the ET data to arrive in time. It'll also hinge on the previous auctions transfers being approved. And then now we have this issue of non-market transfers being approved. Because otherwise someone could hypothetically transfer it on paper in the informal market and transfer the same drop to someone else in the market, right?
And then 2 different time shifted.
Yeah, and I the way I understand the non-market transfers, that those can be done on a rolling basis. You can submit the paper any day of the week throughout the water year. It doesn't operate on a cycle like the auctions will. And so that is so there's a question there. Should we be concerned about that? You know, this committee has already decided in the case of the water use data that it's arriving with a lag, and that the penalty tier is a strong enough incentive that this committee could decide, you know what, same thing. If they transfer it in the informal market and then they turn around and sell it, they're just going to incur the penalty tier. You know, so that's a possible decision. So any initial thoughts there? And I guess, do we even need to worry about this, or is the penalty tier good enough? We can park this one and say it doesn't matter.
I'll leave it up to the committee. I know from a functional standpoint, all of this is going to be a challenge without the water dashboard doing a burden of that work. And we just ran into that in a discussion today at our advisory committee meeting, that there's been a request to input surface water data in a time step greater than the monthly. And as we sat down and talked about it afterwards, if everything's kept on a monthly, everything moves forward under the same cadence.
Yeah.
And anything different than that is going to create a big flux and issues. So Mid-Kaweah is looking to move everything in 30-day increments. Well,
so that would include these transfers. They'd be approved on a 30-day.
I would discuss that with our landowners, that would be an approach that would be at least starting out. If we get better, we get better. But if we commit to something better and then it's a problem, it's a problem.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Okay.
Is there enough teeth in enforcing the penalties?
A great question.
Chuck, that is the multi-million-dollar question, because the only teeth in that is cease and desist orders through a judge.
You can't go and cap somebody's well.
Well, that's what the judge is going to say.
Okay.
Yeah, you're going out with a sheriff, cease and desist.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
You don't have the vehicles that are available like through TID with assessments where the GSAs can file liens on the property?
No, we're looking at that now, but the current strategy is once you go over and you don't stop, Valerie, myself, and our board is in front of a judge with a cease and desist order.
Sure, that's a great question, though. Okay.
To me, I think the dollar amounts are enough. It's just can they be enforced?
But I think the question is, what is the mechanism to prohibit them from pumping it the next? Because that's where the teeth are, that you don't get to pump it the next year.
Correct.
So they'll just keep accumulating additional penalty tier.
Correct. Because what's going to happen eventually is they're not even going to get an allocation because they overpump so much.
That's where I think the property tax lien is a better route, because ultimately the authority there is that you can foreclose on the property. You don't want to do that.
It's interesting you bring that up, Chuck, because we had that specific discussion on Monday at our staff meeting, and we're looking into that right now. But because the Mid-Kaweah GSA is a separate entity than the irrigation district, and we don't in the Mid-Kaweah we don't assess the land. We have no nexus to the land. Now the irrigation district does, And we can move unpaid liens to the ground. So we're looking at that.
Because if you are a white area, for example, and I don't pay my fees and you tell me to pay my fees and you send me more bills. And so then, I mean, you tell me I have a cease and desist and you can't do it anymore. And I just keep pumping.
Yeah, the sheriff's out there then. And I know.
But they have to do it when you get metered and then you see that they still are, and then you're gonna have to go back again to the judge.
Yeah, and I think Colorado had specific provisions within their law. They knew that this was gonna rise, so they have the authority to, I think, shut them down with the power. I think
wow.
is their mechanism, and that's maybe something we have to look at. I think we're all very just hopeful if this all works out, but there will be something or someone that not gonna be cooperative. We're just trying to concentrate on the other 98% that are gonna do it.
Somehow having the, I could do this, but it's not worth it to me to have my whole well cut off because.
And I think a lot of it too is simply growers are very aware of what's happening around them. And there's gonna be peer pressure not to be the one.
That can be powerful.
Yeah, I think that's, a powerful tool. Yeah, but I've been in TID now for 17 years, and we already know, that there are people that don't want to cooperate. Yeah.
So there's also two things I wanted to bring up, questions that came up in the public workshop that I thought were interesting. So we had talked about, an anonymous market. So markets that have transfers that happen through the formal market, the parties won't learn the identity of the counterparties. When we report quantity and price information for each transaction, it won't have names associated with it or APNs. Someone asked, will there be any geographical information about transfers, right? Will we know by analysis zone or the larger trading zone, how much is happening within that region, or that, water was transferred where allowed from, analysis zone 30 to analysis zone 31, is that geographical information going to be available? And so I thought that was an interesting question. And then, obviously the question I would have is, so that I think you would want as much information as possible, but I would wonder at any point would that undermine the anonymity, this geographic location? I don't know the answer. Does that undermine?
If you have a 5-mile limit, but nobody knows where anything came from, then what's the point of even having a limit of any kind? Or zone trading, within zones within a given area.
I think it was brought up in the context of I took it as in the question that came up there was well, where are the active zones? So I know where so where, if I'm in that zone where there's active trading, then I know that otherwise I don't know what's happening around me.
I just know it's happening somewhere in the GSA.
Yeah, and I just don't know. Maybe I'm in the most active trading zone, and I'm the one not doing it. It's not about like, well, I just didn't even know I could do it. And how do I, there's that, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I took it, not like I want to use it as a way to gauge price or anything. It was just like, what am I? It was more like, what is my status in my?
Sure, no, I think that's really valuable. And so I only asked, so how can we, so I would say, let's look to do that, but just with an eye on. Yes, I think that's an interesting.
Yeah, I know that there's a lot of concern over anonymity on both sides of we think we're going to need it, and no, we don't need any of it. But again, I leave it to the committee to, what are the thoughts, and do we start with it and then start without it and go from there.
Matthew, and commodities I've been involved in, there's quite often statistics collected on shipments to export markets, and most of them have restrictions. If there are X number of shippers shipping to a certain market, then the number isn't shown. You know, if there's more than a certain number, then it is shown. I don't know what the right number is. But you could certainly have a rule along those lines. To me, I would think that it'd be nice to know, but I don't know if it's that critical in the first year. If this, it might be something better to be taken up after year one. If you did do it, something along those lines might work.
Okay. Yep. Thanks for that. So that's one to think about. We can bring that back. And then this one has sort of come up in the committee, but it came up again. I've heard people mention this idea. Committee members mention this, but it came up explicitly in the public workshop. Because of this 30-day lag, is the last, so we anticipate running October 1st through September 30th. Is the final auction going to happen on September 30th?
Yeah, it was a good question.
Or do we need to wait a whole month until you learn what your pumping was as of September 30th? And so we have a true up, we actually match
True up
the
market.
first month of the next year, but what we're trading is last year's water, not this year's. And then I guess I would ask, because the ET data arrives a month later, I assume there'd be no problem with calculating carryover. That wouldn't interrupt calculating carryover, and carryover would just be calculated after that last true up period, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're gonna true up the September in November. What we're finding out is the actual year does not probably end until December. So you can close the books on
Right.
previous year.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So that
So could you even trade a year in advance back to true up the year before?
that sounds complex. I can't wrap my head around that. But I want to know, can you? Yeah, so on.
So I went over.
So on, I guess it would be October 31st, 1 month after the end of the water year. Can we do one more auction?
No, you would
where you're
actually,
trading last year's water.
you would actually need to do it. It would happen in November. The auction would happen in November.
Okay.
Because the data comes in on October 31st. It gets
You
inputted.
need a little time. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So say
Then
November
they get the-
15th.
Then they get to look at it and then they have to do a true up.
Okay. Yeah. So that's I think it's an interesting question the committee should think about. Do we want to just say, no, you need to be forward looking. You need to figure out how much you're going to need, estimate how much you're going to need, do your transactions so that we're done with transactions when the water year ends? Or could we do a true up period?
Could be
after?
big ramifications too.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I haven't even thought through what does that mean when we're selling last year's water, but the water year's, yeah, anyway, so I have to,
Maybe we had, go ahead.
I was wondering about it in context of, what East has, where transferred water has to be used in the current year. Could you be trading current year water in November for looking backward? Is that current year or future year?
that's what, so this is an accounting exercise, right? Part of it is we need to make sure the accounting is really clear. No, we're actually
What's
truing up.
the current year and what's the future year?
So if somebody, so on November, because on November 15th, you will not have your October water use data, because that's the new water year. November 15th, you're only going to have last year's water data. And so then, and there might, so for example, there might be somebody who had bought water, didn't use it, and it's going to expire. They might want to turn around and sell that to somebody.
To true up their
who was-
account.
To
Yeah,
true up
yeah.
their account. So there might be, what's nice, attractive about it is there might be truing up in both directions, which actually generates market activity you wouldn't have otherwise.
It's called like a true up auction.
Yeah, so anyway, that's something to think about. It's one of those ones where I'm not aware of anybody that does it. So we'd really have to think, could there be some unintended consequence? I'm not sure.
Well, it's gonna get really complicated. A whole bunch of like last minute trade.
Yeah.
Everybody's gonna wait till November 15th.
Yeah.
And then it's gonna be a whole bunch of water going
Yeah.
different directions.
Yeah. So anyway, something to think about.
With a lot of market distorting circumstances.
All right, so I think that is everything I had planned for today. So, any final, next time, we'll come back, we'll touch base on the allocation system again after I've had time to circulate the matrix. We'll address these and other outstanding questions that still remain. But that's all I had planned for today. I do want to remind you, there's the office hour tomorrow if you're interested in sitting in, or if you know somebody who might be, who's not a committee member, please tell others. The office hour 4:30 to 6 tomorrow. You should have received the flyer that has the Zoom link for that virtual meeting. So that's the bookkeeping stuff. Any other comments and questions from anybody on the committee or in attendance today? All right, thanks, everybody. I think that's it.
Thank you. It was a good session.
Yeah, thanks for the deep dive.